What is going on, fellas? We are back. It is Thursday, which means we are breaking down all of the Week 14 games. We have 6 teams on bye this week, so there is less games that we have to go through, but nonetheless, a lot of important decisions to be made. I'm sure a lot of you guys are on the doorstep of securing a bye. You're on the doorstep of making the playoffs. Maybe you're trying to avoid a loser punishment. Whatever your needs are, we should have you covered in today's video. Let's kick things off. We go game by game here, going through over-unders and spreads and everything you guys need to know to set your fantasy football lineups. We're going to start with Thursday Night Football, and we got a doozy tonight, fellas. Packers at Lions. The Lions are 3.5-point home favorites on Thursday Night Football. The Lions implied for 27.5 points. Packers implied for 24. A whopping 51.5-point over-under. That is the highest on the entire slate. If you're wondering, should you be starting players from this game? The answer is most likely yes. The over is actually catching all of the steam as well. 16% of the money from the sharps versus the public is actually on the over as well. So it's expected to be high scoring. The over is actually catching some steam. That is the perfect fantasy football cocktail that we're looking at here. Both the Lions and the Packers in decent spots as far as their offense versus the opposing defense. Some key matchups to pay attention to here. Both quarterbacks do actually have difficult matchups when it comes to their own fantasy production, but I do expect both Jordan Love and Jared Goff to be able to deliver the ball efficiently tonight to their playmakers. Gibbs and Montgomery about a league average matchup. Josh Jacobs a little bit tougher, but remember that the Lions are just completely decimated. Their top 3 defensive tackles are out. I believe I saw a stat online that they're like top 5 edge rushers coming into the season are out for the year right now, so we're not looking at a very good situation as far as their defense is concerned, so I feel pretty good that Jacob should be able to get the ball going tonight on the ground. With Romeo Doubs out for the Green Bay Packers, that opens up the door for Jaden Reed, Christian Watson, and Dontavian Wicks to be the consistent 3 wide receiver set to go for throughout the entire game. We've seen Jaden Reed have monster games when Romeo Doubs was out last week, and also just in general, when he plays over 75% of the routes, he's averaging nearly 15 PPR points per game. So if you're wondering if you should start him tonight, I would absolutely fire him up. The whole, passing game in general, 23rd rated Lions defense against fantasy wide receivers. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, a little bit tougher matchups for them, but Jameson Williams on the outside, the tougher matchup. So if you have St. Brown and you're worried about his matchup being a little bit more difficult, the slot cornerback for the Green Bay Packers is the worst corner on the roster, so you should feel comfortable that St. Brown should get it done tonight. Sam Laporta and Tucker Kraft. I think Sam Laporta is a great streaming option. He scored 2 touchdowns last week. Should have a pretty good, basis for some good production this week. Tucker Kraft, maybe not so much, not as great of a matchup for him, but nonetheless, this should be a really, really fun game, getting a bang out to start this Thursday Night Football slate and this Week 14 slate. A very good game to kick us off. So moving into the Sunday games, we do not have a couple teams. Like I mentioned, there are 6 teams on bye this week, so we only have 7 1 p.m. games and 3 4 p.m. games, and then regular Sunday Night Football and Monday Night Football. So a little bit less to deal with here. I'm sure a lot of you guys are missing your Houston Texans, your Indianapolis Colts, so on and so forth. So you might have to dig a little bit deeper in your start-sit decisions. Jets at Dolphins, the first game of the 1 p.m. slate that we're going to talk about here. The Dolphins are 6-point home favorites. Not a whole lot going on as far as the game environment is concerned. It is a 44.5-point over-under, which is pretty solid. The under is catching a little bit of the steam. Pace of play is about league average, so on and so forth. The key matchups to pay attention to, the Aaron Rodgers, New York Jets-led passing game here with Garrett Wilson, with Devontae Adams against the Dolphins secondary is a pretty difficult matchup, so I can't imagine, given how the Jets have played. They looked a little bit better last week against the Seahawks, but given how the Jets have played this year, I can't imagine there's going to be fireworks coming from their passing game, so keep that in mind. I don't think you have to start Devontae Adams, who's a little bit more of a fringe guy. Wilson, probably a starter for most people, but if you have better options, I don't think you have to start any of those guys. Tua Tagovailoa, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, they're in a better position. Tua Tagovailoa, definitely a top 12 quarterback for me on the week. Tyreek Hill, a must start, and Jalen Waddle, a pretty good option as well. When it comes to the run game, Breece Hall is not practicing right now, so assuming Breece Hall plays, he has a very good matchup, 26th ranked Miami Dolphins run defense, but he did not practice Wednesday, did not practice again today, so we'll have to wait and see what the situation is there. If If he is out, then it would probably be Braylon Allen taking over most of the workload. Make sure he is rostered in your league right now because, like I said, Wednesday and Thursday, Breece Hall not practicing. And last week when we had the scare with Breece Hall's health, it was just Wednesday that he didn't practice. He did actually come back to practice in a limited capacity on Thursday, but that has not been the case so far this week, at least from the reports I've seen so far. Devon Achane versus the Jets run defense, not a very good matchup, but he does catch passes. He's explosive, not too worried about that. Jonnu Smith has been outstanding the last 3 weeks. I believe he is the tight end one over the last 3 games. He has a terrible matchup against the Jets, but given how he is playing, I feel like he's pretty much a must start at this point. Miami defense and kicker also definitely in play, knowing that Rodgers and the offense have struggled, and the kicker for Jason Sanders there, the Dolphins are implied for a decent amount of points there. Like I said, 25.25, which is usually the metric I like to look at for kickers, is the implied point total, because that's obviously going to be indicative of how many points they put up in the game. So Falcons at Vikings, the next game here, minus 5.5 point favorites here for the Minnesota Vikings. This is the Kirk Cousins revenge game for the Atlanta Falcons here. Minnesota is implied for 25.5 points. Atlanta for 20. 45.5 point over-under. The under actually catching some of the steam, which is a little surprising to me. I do think this game could end up being pretty high scoring. The pace of play is pretty strong. Minnesota's DVOA on offense, their advantage is pretty strong as well. We do have a double shadow matchup here as far as key matchups to pay attention to. You have Justin Jefferson versus A.J. Terrell. You have Drake London versus Stephon Gilmore, each number 1 receiver going up against the number 1 corner of the opposing team. When it comes to Sam Darnold, he is one of the best streaming quarterbacks on the entire slate. I believe he is my QB7 this week. Him, Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson, I'm sure they will all do some severe damage to the Atlanta Falcons secondary there. Kirk Cousins, again, difficult matchup against the Minnesota Vikings. They got a good pass rush, good blitz packages, all that kind of stuff. But it is a revenge game for Kirk Cousins, so you got to keep that in mind. He is going to be really, really motivated to play well in this one. Both running backs, Aaron Jones and Bijan Robinson, have bottom 10 matchups as far as their, efficiency against opposing running backs, but I feel very confident in both of those guys' workloads and how they've been playing as of late, that they should be just fine. And then, like I said, keep in mind that the number 1 receivers of each team could have a tougher matchup, so we could see a Jordan Addison week or a TJ Hawkinson week or a Darnell Mooney week and so on and so forth, because the number 1s have a little bit tougher of matchups there. So New Orleans Saints at New York Giants. The Saints are 4.5 point road favorites here, so the Giants not getting any love from the Vegas betting markets. 41 point over under. Pretty low game environment here. The under catching a decent amount of the steam. The Saints offense does have a pretty sizable advantage against the New York Giants defense. They have not been good, especially the last couple of weeks. It really feels like they've kind of given up on this season. So the Saints in a pretty good spot here. The only problem is we don't really know who's a good start on New Orleans outside of Alvin Kamara. There's not a whole lot of must-start players here. At wide receiver, you're going to be starting Marquez Valdez-Scantling. Without Taysom Hill now at tight end, are you going to be starting Juwan Johnson? I don't think anybody's messing with Derek Carr. Both quarterbacks have below-average matchups. Don't really mess with either of those two guys. Both running backs have top 8 matchups, so of course you are starting Alvin Kamara, you are starting Tyrone Tracy. Malik Neighbors does have a very good matchup against the New Orleans secondary. Of course, now for the last couple of weeks without Marshawn Lattimore, they've been really susceptible to number 1 wide receivers. And then the Saints wide receivers, again, MVS, whoever you want to talk about here, and then Juwan Johnson, bottom 10 matchup across the board for those guys. So I probably wouldn't mess around with them, although it does stack up to be a half-decent matchup for New Orleans' offense. If you are looking for a defensive streamer, I do believe the Saints are one of the best on the entire slate, because this is not expected to be a high-scoring game, because they're favored according to Vegas, and I do think you can mess around with Blake Grupe, the kicker, as well. So Panthers at Eagles, a game environment that I believe has the highest spread of any game this week. 12.5 point home favorites are the Philadelphia Eagles. The over-under is set all the way, though, at 46 points. The over catching a little bit of the steam. Decent pace of play. Philadelphia's DVOA on offense versus Carolina's defense is a sizable advantage, and vice versa, the opposite, because the Eagles have a very good defense. The Panthers, while they've been playing well on offense as of late, generally have not been good this year, so that is something to keep in mind. The Panthers have been covering the spread the last couple of weeks, even though they've been sizable underdogs against the Buccaneers and also against the Kansas City Chiefs. I feel pretty confident that they could keep this one closer to 12.5 points, but we'll have to wait and see how Bryce Young shows up. I've been very impressed with him. Hopefully he continues to do that. Jalen Hurts versus the Carolina pass defense. Feel very, very good if you're starting Jalen Hurts. He has a monster smash spot here. Same goes for Saquon Barkley, who has the single easiest run defense in the NFL, which just saw Bucky Irving post a career high 154 rushing yards against them last week. It could be another eruption spot for Saquon Barkley. The wide receiver position is a little bit sketchy on both sides of the ball here. We got A.J. Brown going up against J.C. Horn in shadow coverage. He did not do a very good job of Mike Evans last week, so I wouldn't be too worried for A.J. Brown. Bryce Young and Xavier Legette and Adam Thielen, however, have a very, very difficult matchup there against Philadelphia's secondary is really strong, honestly. They've been the best secondary in the NFL against fantasy wide receivers. So if you were thinking of, I'm going to just play Xavier Legette, I'm just going to play Adam Thielen, if you have better options, I don't think you necessarily have to. While I think the Panthers are good enough on offense to move the ball and get some first downs and stuff, they're still the Carolina Panthers. We got to be a little bit worried about them traveling to Philadelphia against a really strong defense. And then Dallas Goedert, who is currently banged up right now, may not play in this game. If he does play, he has one of the easiest matchups on the entire slate for tight ends, so he would be a very good streaming option if he's out there. Philadelphia defense and Philadelphia kicker, when you have a 12.5-point home favorite, definitely going to be pieces that you want to go after in your matchups as well. So moving on to the next game that we have here, that is the Browns at Steelers. The Steelers are 6.5-point home favorites. If you guys recall, a couple Thursdays ago, we had the Cleveland Browns upset the Pittsburgh Steelers, but that was in Cleveland in a snow game, but it was a lot of fun to watch. Of course, we saw Jameis Winston kind of put the team on his back. We saw Nick Chubb score 2 touchdowns. An interesting game, and it happened very, very recently, so we have a lot to go off of as far as who these teams are based on that performance. But the Steelers probably set up to win this one and take the or split the season series between these two AFC North opponents. 44.5-point over-under. The over catching some steam. The pace of play actually stacks up pretty well as well. When it comes to the Browns and Steelers key matchups, both quarterbacks not really in good spots. So I know Russell Wilson had a monster game against Cincinnati last week. I feel like a lot of people are going to be really ready to just, I got Jane Daniels on bye, I got Anthony Richardson on bye, whatever quarterback you might have on bye, you go pick up Russell Wilson, no problem. You throw him into your lineup because he had a great game. And I'm personally doing this in one of my leagues because I do have Lamar Jackson out on bye, but I will say I'm looking for other options around the league as well, because I don't want to just throw Russell Wilson out there knowing that the Cleveland Browns are a lot better against the pass. It could be cold weather. It is in Pittsburgh. Definitely keep in mind all of those factors. So don't just, throw out Russell Wilson out there. And same with Jameis Winston too. Obviously he had a great game against the Denver Broncos, but this one doesn't really stack up both for each quarterback as great matchups for the other guy. Nick Chubb, better matchup for him. 19th rated defense are the Pittsburgh Steelers, so you could probably fire him up. Najee Harris, 7th rated defense are the Cleveland Browns against the running back position. So not as good of a matchup. He did have a pretty terrible game when they played against the Cleveland Browns the first time, and it ended up being Jaylen Warren who did most of the damage in that snow game. Jerry Jeudy is expected to see shadow coverage from Joey Porter Jr. You're probably starting him, especially considering what he did to the Denver Broncos and Patrick Surtain just last week. So you're probably playing Jerry Jeudy, but keep in mind he does have a tougher matchup. George Pickens and Pat Freiermuth both have top 8 matchups at their respective positions, so I feel pretty good about the passing weapons of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And then David Njoku just had a monster game. He has a good matchup yet again. Pittsburgh defense and kicker definitely in play, especially knowing, Jameis Winston, what did he throw for, like 450 yards and 4 touchdowns, but he still threw 2 pick sixes. Like, that's who Jameis Winston is. So you feel pretty comfortable that you could, get some points out of the Pittsburgh Steelers defense there. So Raiders at Buccaneers. Next game we're going to talk about here, rematch of Super Bowl 37. Go Bucs. We absolutely destroyed them in that game. Buccaneers, 6.5-point home favorites, 46-point over catching a good amount of the steam. This game isn't overly interesting. I feel like we kind of are expecting it to go a certain way. I do think, even as a Bucs fan, I'm trying to take my bias out of this. I do think it will go that way. I think the Bucs will probably win this game handily, but I do think Aiden O'Connell, Brock Bowers, Jacoby Myers can still get there as far as their own fantasy production, because let's face it, the Bucs are not the greatest defense in the world. I do like this game to probably be sneaky high scoring. Both quarterbacks have top 10 matchups. I don't think anybody is down bad enough that they would have to start Aiden O'Connell, but Baker Mayfield is a top 5 quarterback for me on the week. He is absolutely in your lineup. Bucky Irving, an elite running back play yet again this week. He is in your lineup. Alexander Mattison, probably going to be back this week. We'll have to wait and see on his health status, but I do think he's a viable option this week, given the workload he was getting before the injury and the fact that Zamir White isn't practicing right now, and Amir Abdullah and Sincere McCormick, those type of guys, weren't really getting it done on the ground. I think Mattison will probably resume his full workload. We'll have to wait and see on that. Mike Evans, tough matchup for him. Jacoby Myers, easy matchup for him. I think both tight ends could go nuts in this game. Brock Bowers, whatever his over-under is for receiving yards, just take the over, because I can tell you right now, we are going to have a problem trying to stop Brock Bowers over the middle of the field. And Cade Otton, probably the same thing too. I think he has a chance to have a very solid game in this one as well. So getting into the final 1 p.m. game of the slate, we have the Jaguars at the Tennessee Titans. The Titans are 3.5-point home favorites in this one. The Titans also implied for just over 21 points. Over-under is the lowest of any game on the slate. So if you're looking for, tiebreakers and start-sit decisions, you probably don't need to start too many players from this game, but I do really like some of the matchups that we have here. You have Will Levis and Trevor Lawrence if he ends up playing. We don't know that 100% if he's going to be back or not. If he ends up playing, he has a good matchup, and again, Will Levis also has a good matchup. I think you could do worse than starting Will Levis on, bye weeks with all the quarterbacks that we have out this week, like Jaden Daniels, Lamar Jackson. If you had to start Will Levis, I don't think it's outrageous. Tony Pollard, Travis Etienne. Pollard has a great matchup. Etienne, not so much. So, again, you're firing up Tony Pollard. Calvin Ridley and Nick Westbrook-Akine have awesome matchups, and this is a revenge game for Calvin Ridley, so I feel pretty good that he is going to have a probably monster performance in this one. Brian Thomas Jr. and Evan Ingram, difficult matchup for them on that side of the ball. Both defenses, given the over-under, I think are in play as streamers, but if I had to pick one, it would be the Tennessee Titans defense, since they are the home team and they're the team that is favored by 3.5 points. Plus, if we don't get Trevor Lawrence in this game and it is Mac Jones, I feel pretty confident that the Titans defense can generate some turnovers or whatever the case is. So if you need a defense, I do think both of them are in play, but definitely Tennessee's the better one. Seattle Seahawks at Arizona Cardinals. The next game here, the Cardinals 2.5-point favorites, over-under of 44.5 points. The pace of play the fastest of any game on the entire slate. We've seen these NFC West games get a little bit shootouty, but I will say this one's really cut and dry. When you look at the key matchups, if you look at both of these defenses, they're both just like below average across the board. So every position, Geno Smith, Kyler Murray, they have an above average matchup. The running backs, Kenneth Walker, James Conner, they have an above average matchup. The wide receiver cores, Marvin Harrison Jr., DK Metcalf, JSN, they have above average matchups. One matchup note that I would, hammer home is that Jackson Smith and Jigba going up against the slot corner of the Arizona Cardinals. The Cardinals have been very good against slot receivers, so it might profile more as a DK Metcalf game, assuming he is healthy. So just keep that in mind for the wide receiver cores. But generally speaking, you're probably starting most players in this game. Trey McBride has a top 10 to 12 matchup as well. Noah Fant's been getting a lot more usage in the positive direction, so maybe he's a viable streamer. You probably don't have to dig that deep, though. And then Arizona's defense and both kickers definitely in play. I think Arizona's defense is a really underrated play this week because the Geno Smith-led offense has been rather inconsistent, and especially going on the road to a division opponent, I could see Arizona having a pretty good performance here. So Bills at Rams, the next game we're going to talk about. 4.5-point road favorites are Buffalo. Buffalo's been awesome. Obviously, they beat the crap out of San Francisco on Sunday night. Over-under of 49.5 points, so we're expecting some point production in this game. Pace of play, second fastest on the slate or third fastest on the slate, and the DVOA matchups for both of these offenses are pretty favorable as well. When it comes to Josh Allen, the Bills wide receivers, the passing game in general, 22nd easiest matchup are the Rams defense. They had a stretch where they were playing really well, and I think their pass rush still is, but Josh Allen, Keon Coleman if he plays, Amari Cooper, and Khalil Shakir should be able to get it done through the air against this defense. Matthew Stafford, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, not really a great matchup set up for them. I think that the Bills defense is playing super well. We saw them basically shut down the 49ers on Sunday Night Football. It is in Los Angeles, so we don't have to worry about, weather concerns with the Buffalo Bills this week. Kyron Williams versus the Buffalo run defense is a very good matchup, so it should be a good Kyron get-right game. He hasn't quite been the same, since about mid-season. We haven't really seen that blow-up 30-point bomb from Kyron Williams, but I do think we should see him, start to correct himself a little bit here, especially in this matchup. James Cook, a little bit of a tougher matchup for him. Dalton Kincaid, great matchup for him, assuming he plays. He's been out for the last couple of weeks with an injury. And Tyler Bass, also a very good streaming option at the kicker position. So Bears at 49ers, the final game of the 4 p.m. window, and then we'll move into the final primetime games. The 49ers are 4-point favorites. Not really sure sure why. They're not really playing that well. They don't have Christian McCaffrey now. I'm not exactly sure how San Fran is going to put up points with the way that Debo is playing, the fact that they're on their third string running back, and Juwan Jennings is basically the only consistent piece of their offense, and that includes how Brock Purdy is playing right now. I don't feel great about San Francisco for the rest of the season. This might just be one of those years where you see a past Super Bowl team get decimated by injuries and they kind of fall off the wagon. I think when the Eagles won the Super Bowl in 2017, we saw them the year after just have like a brutal season where they barely snuck into the playoffs, and then I think the Falcons ended up knocking them out. This kind of reminds me of that team, this 49ers team, and they didn't even actually win the Super Bowl. So both quarterbacks, bottom 10 matchups. I probably wouldn't mess with either of Brock Purdy or Caleb Williams. I think there are better streamers out there, and I'll talk about some of those guys at the end of the video. Isaac Guerendo and DeAndre Swift both have above average matchups, so if you needed a streaming option at running back, I feel like a lot of people were dropping a lot of fab on Isaac Guerendo, knowing that Jordan Mason is out and Christian McCaffrey is out. He is definitely a viable starter this week. DeAndre Swift, of course, also a viable starter, although he is kind of banged up in practice right now, so keep an eye on that. Both wide receiver cores have bottom 8 matchups, so again, Debo's playing terribly at the moment. Juwan Jennings has been a little bit up and down with the way that the offense has looked. DJ Moore and Keenan Allen have been awesome, so you're going to be firing those guys up. But just keep in mind with these wide receivers in this game that it's not, all sunshine and rainbows. I do feel like there's a lot up in the air with the strength of some of these defenses against the pass and also how the offenses have been playing through the passing game, again, minus how Keenan Allen and DJ Moore have been. George Kittle and Cole Kmet, probably starters. Definitely Kittle is a starter for a lot of you guys. He has a league average matchup. Cole Kmet, maybe don't mess with him. He hasn't really been all that productive, and he has a bad matchup. 49ers defense and kicker, definitely in play, although I will say I don't really trust them because I don't think that the 49ers are a lock to win this game. Even though they are at home against a rookie quarterback who's a little turnover prone, I do feel a little bit on the shaky side with that situation, but Jake Moody definitely a very good option this week. Chargers at Chiefs, that is the Sunday night football game. For Collinsworth and Tirico here. 4-point favorites are the Kansas City Chiefs. The over-under is set at just 43 points, which is a little bit surprising given that the Chiefs, again, they have Mahomes and the Chargers have Herbert. I get that both of these teams have kind of been somewhat run-heavy teams and, playing in low-score games, but 43 points seems a little low for these two guys, so I would personally be taking the over in this one, and the Sharps agree with me here. Highest percentage of the money on the over versus the public bets there, so I feel pretty good about this game maybe being a little bit higher scoring than people think. Mahomes and DeAndre Hopkins / Xavier Worthy have the 24th easiest pass defense matchup, so I feel pretty good about all of those guys. Again, Worthy's kind of a fringe starter, but Mahomes and D-Hop probably in your lineup. Justin Herbert and Ladd McConkey / Quentin Johnston, a little bit sketchier. I think you got to downgrade them given the strength of the Kansas City pass defense, the way that Ladd McConkey's been banged up, the way Quentin Johnston's been dropping passes. It's a little bit more of a sketchy situation, especially now, too. You're going to be without J.K. Dobbins for this game, and, last week we saw kind of how that affected the offense. So that's a little bit of a sketchy situation for Justin Herbert there. I don't think you have to play him. I don't think you have to play really anybody on this Chargers team outside of Ladd McConkey, assuming he's healthy. Seems to me to be the only must-start player. Both running backs have bottom 5 matchups. Again, Gus Edwards, not a must-start by any means, but given the bye weeks that we have, you're probably throwing him out there because he is a healthy running back who's not on bye. And then Isaiah Pacheco, we saw him work in, I think it was about 35% of the snaps last week. We saw Kareem Hunt still heavily involved. I think that percentage will probably flip-flop going forward, where Pacheco will be up near 60-70%. Kareem Hunt probably down at like 30%. We'll have to wait and see what that looks like, but I still think Pacheco is probably a viable starter for you guys. Travis Kelce versus the Chargers defense, tough matchup, but you're probably still starting him. If you want a streamer, Will Dissly's not a bad option, and both kickers are definitely in play in this game. Like I said, I do think it could be a little bit higher scoring than people think. Final game of the slate here, we have the Bengals at Dallas Cowboys. 5.5-point favorites on the road are the Cincinnati Bengals. This game also very high scoring, 49.5-point over-under. Over-catching a big portion of the steam. The pace of play is very solid. Cincinnati's DVOA on offense versus the Cowboys' DVOA on defense also presents a big matchup advantage. Joe Burrow's in your lineup. T. Higgins is in your lineup. Jamar Chase is in your lineup. Chase Brown, absolute smash spot for him into your lineup against the Dallas Cowboys, 28th ranked against the run. T. Higgins is expected to see some shadow coverage from Deron Bland. So again, I don't really understand how they keep deploying wide receiver cornerback matchups in a way that they take away T. Higgins, but not Jamar Chase, who we all kind of know is the better receiver. But I guess they just move Chase around the formation enough that they don't feel comfortable leaving shadow coverages. It's not just the Cowboys how they're playing the Bengals. Every team plays the Bengals like this. It's really weird. When they play the Steelers, they throw Joey Porter on him, let him do his thing, and then they kind of bracket cover Jamar Chase. Again, it makes sense, but I just think if you're going to take away one of them, it should probably be Chase, not Higgins. But anyways, T. Higgins expect to see shadow coverage, wide receiver core for the Cowboys, above average matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals. CeeDee Lamb still dealing with the shoulder injury, but hopefully he'll be back healthy. Had about 10 days to recover from that. Jake Ferguson, a decent streaming option at tight end. I'll talk about him a little bit in a second as well. And then the Cincinnati defense and kicker also in play, knowing that McPherson's going to have potential field goal opportunities. And you have Cooper Rush, who is definitely susceptible to going down, turning the ball over, all that kind of stuff. So streaming quarterbacks, streaming tight ends, streaming defenses, and streaming kickers. And then I'll give you guys my Thursday Night Football picks at the end of this video. Streaming quarterbacks, pretty straightforward. Again, if you have Jaden Daniels, Lamar Jackson, some of these guys on bye, and, I'd imagine these guys aren't available on your waiver wire, but if they are, Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold, the primo options there. I did talk about Russell Wilson already as a guy that you maybe want to be a little bit nervous about just because he had a great week last week. Everybody's expecting him to do it again. But again, there's a number of good quarterback options on bye. So if you need a quarterback option, Russell Wilson is my QB 11 this week going up against the Cleveland Browns. They are pretty strong against the pass, but the wide receiver, George Pickens and Pat Freiermuth, have decent matchups to exploit that. Will Levis against the Jags, that is a really easy matchup. And like I said, I think Calvin Ridley is going to be really motivated to stick it to his former team there. Streaming tight ends, we have Jonnu Smith, Evan Ingram, Cade Otton, and Jake Ferguson. All of them kind of represent their own, upside. Jonnu Smith has just been awesome the last couple of weeks. Evan Ingram gets the targets. Cade Otton has a great matchup. And Jake Ferguson is a bit of a combination of all of those things. So streaming kickers, Tyler Bass of the Buffalo Bills, great matchup against the Los Angeles Rams. Brandon Aubrey of the Dallas Cowboys, high-scoring game there in Cincinnati. And I think if there's one thing I've learned about the Cooper Rush Cowboys is that when they look good, they're a field goal machine. They're not the type of offense that's going to put up 35 points, but they can generate a lot of field goals. So that's why I like Brandon Aubrey, and he's also just one of the better kickers in the league. And then Jake Moody for the 49ers. Again, I feel pretty similar about the 49ers as I do about the Cowboys, which is like when they're good, they're probably a field goal machine at this point without McCaffrey, without Ayuk. Obviously, Debo not playing super well. So I feel pretty good about Jake Moody this week. And then streaming defenses to look out for. You got the Steelers versus Jameis Winston. Obviously, target a guy who throws pick sixes like it's his day job. Titans versus Trevor Lawrence / Mac Jones if Trevor Lawrence isn't ready to go. I do think that the Jaguars are going to have a tough time moving the ball just in general. The Titans defense at home has been pretty strong. Bucs versus Aiden O'Connell. Aiden O'Connell looked really good against the Chiefs last week, but I don't think he's the type of quarterback that's going to carry that momentum every single game. So if the Tampa Bay Buccaneers can play really well on defense, I do think they could turn him over a couple of times. They're also due for a couple of turnovers in this game. Eagles versus Bryce Young. Again, Bryce has looked good, but the Eagles defense is better, and they're at home. And the Saints defense versus Drew Lock. I mean, that one's just a really easy one. The Saints defense isn't good, but Drew Lock is absolutely terrible, and so is the Giants offense. So those are all the matchups that matter. I shall get into my picks for Thursday Night Football to give you guys a hint of what I might be looking at tonight. I do think that Jaden Reed is due for a big game. I talked about it on my TikTok. I always talk about these on my TikTok, but what I said was that Jaden Reed has the wide receiver cornerback matchup that is most favorable, which is Amik Robertson in the slot. And when Romeo Doubs has been out, he has been highly, highly productive. Anytime he gets more than 75, 80% of the routes, like I said earlier in the video, he's up near 15 PPR points. Jahmyr Gibbs, I like him to go higher than his receiving yards because the Lions are, when they're in close games, which has only been 6 of them this year because they've blown out so many teams, Jahmyr Gibbs averages 29 receiving yards per game in those games and went over this total in 5 of those 6. And then Sam Laporta, I like him to go higher than his fantasy points in half PPR as well because he's been getting a lot of red zone usage lately. He's been getting a little bit more target usage, so I like him to potentially score, potentially have a big game in this one. So that is my Thursday Night Football pick'em slate. If you guys do want to tail this entry, of course, I do break this down on Twitter, break it down over on my TikTok. If you want to tail, you can head on over to Underdog Fantasy. You can use the promo code FSE when you sign up. You'll get a Jordan Love free square to add into this entry, which would make it a 10x if it ends up hitting instead of a 6x. And also, too, you get up to $1,000 in bonus cash. You get our weekly rankings manifesto for free for the rest of the season to get you through crunch time to help you make those difficult start-sit decisions. So if that interests you, link down below in the pinned comment for that. But with that being said, peace out, and we'll talk to you soon.